Okay, so now you should all get the little warning that we're recording, so you can leave if you want to. Um, all right, so I am delighted this evening to
I,
welcome J.
I'm sorry, do I click on got it or leave meeting or whatever?
Just say got it. Don't say leave meeting.
Right.
No, don't leave.
Okay, there
Don't
we go.
say leave meeting. We don't want you to leave. Okay, so it's my pleasure this evening to welcome J.Chester Johnson. Chester is the author of the poetry collections St. Paul's Chapel and Selected Shorter Poems, and Now and Then Selected Longer Poems, the nonfiction work Auden the Psalms and Me, and of course, most important to us, Damaged Heritage, the Elaine Massacre and a Story of Reconciliation. My own connection to Chester and to Damaged Heritage dates from 2015 when I heard him give the Martin Luther King Day homily at Trinity Church, in which he spoke eloquently about the Elaine Massacre. At the time, my reaction was similar to that Sheila Walker reports in the book. When I was a child, she asked Elaine, like the name. I had never heard of the Elaine Massacre, but over the years, I was to learn much more, culminating when Damaged Heritage was published in 2020, which we all remember was the middle of the pandemic lockdown. Maybe not an ideal time to launch a book, but maybe in a way it was, given the number of opportunities I had to hear Chester discuss the book over Zoom and on other platforms. And then I was lucky enough to be able to join a book discussion on Zoom at the Church of the Heavenly Rest, in which we not only read and dissected Damaged Heritage, but had the opportunity to meet with Chester when we finished the book, sort of like we're doing tonight. And over the ensuing years, I have met Chester in person at various events. We're not just Zoom buddies. And I'm also happy that tonight we're joined by Frida Johnson, who lived with this book and its subject matter for years, and may have some insights to offer in response to some of your specific questions. I did send Chester the list of questions from last week, but being a spontaneous kind of guy, Chester would like to keep this as informal as possible. So after I ask my question to start things up, I'm going to have you all raise your hands and I'll call on you and you remember what your questions were. And so here's my question that I've been wondering about for a while. One of the beauties of your book for me, and I always say this when I tell people about the book, is that it sparks the reader to recall things from their own past or their background and delve into related discussions. And I wonder if that was part of your intention in writing the book, to encourage others to explore their own journeys in anti-racism and social action.
That's a very good question. I guess I'm as much a storyteller as I am anything else, and there are always mutual stories to be told when one writes their own story. And as a result of the way in which I wrote this book, I've had so many people send emails to me to tell me their story. I'm not clever enough to have anticipated that response, or that I had an ulterior motive by telling that entire story of Elaine Massacre, Sheila, and my relationship, and my relationship with my maternal grandfather, who participated in the in the massacre. But I think it's redounded to my benefit that I did write it that way, because so many people have reached out to me to tell me their own story.
Okay, thank you, Chester. All right, I will open the floor now. Ralph.
Okay, thanks. Well, great to thanks so much for coming. Nice to see you and talk to you after the time we've spent reading the book pretty carefully. I was particularly interested in the memorial, the Elaine Massacre Memorial, which was a remarkable achievement. That is something that so few people have heard about. Some presumably just through natural ignorance, some people just deliberately for forgetting it. But I was curious as to what that process was, whether there was much pushback or resistance. Was there any public approval required or public process, or was it entirely privately funded on private property, which I guess would reduce the chances for pushback or negotiation? And I also noticed that as far as I could tell, with the memorial or with the monument and the poem, there's not a lot of detail. When I originally heard about the monument, I thought it was going to be a plaque describing what had happened. But in fact, it's sort of a very moving memorial, but it doesn't really go into much detail. And I wondered if that was sort of deliberate to avoid too much controversy about it, or what was the process, and what was there? The rest of the book suggests that there would have been a substantial resistance to it, and I wonder if there was. Thanks.
All right, I'll cover the last issue first, if I may. What was amazing about this event, about the massacre, was the way in which it came together rather easily. I expect a lot more pushback than existed. Part of it was that this project, maybe I could just quickly tell you how this project came about. I had been given an award by the University of Arkansas back in 2010. And part of that, I was interviewed extensively by, it's called the Pryor Center of Oral and Visual History, and which is an arm of the university. And after I was interviewed, I asked the question, because this is a group supposedly knowledgeable in a broad sense as well as narrow sense about things in the state of Arkansas. And I asked them, are you aware of the Elaine Race Massacre? And I was told that nobody in the organization knew a thing about it. So the assistant director really jumped in with both feet. He read all the books on it he could possibly get. He looked at all the videos, et cetera, and he set up an interview down in Phillips County, where this massacre occurred, with a person named David Solomon. David Solomon, the older David Solomon, he was, I think, about 97 or so. So when he was interviewed, his son, David P. Solomon, came down from New York to be with him and interview. And he knew, the older Solomon knew much about the massacre and began to provide further enlightenment. Well, as it turned out, the Solomon family became very interested in providing a memorial for this purpose. In part, it came from a series of meetings here in New York City that I had with both of those David Solomon's. And we discussed what we should be doing, and so it narrowed down to either we would put a memorial in front of the county courthouse in property, our own property that the Solomons owned, or we would prevail on the state to allow us to put a memorial up alongside the Little Rock Nine. You know about Little Rock Central, and so there's on the grounds of the Capitol, there's a memorial to those 9 students that went to Little Rock Central and all of that. And we thought we'll put it there. Ultimately, we decided there was just too much hassle to do that. So the Solomons owned this property right in front of, and the Solomon family, and I just think you need to have a little bit of to know what actually, because you ask a very broad question, and I think you need to know all. The Solomon family, it's a Jewish family that had been in Phillips County for 5 generations. And one member of their family became the first Jewish federal judge appointed in the United States. A very prominent family, farmers, et cetera, et cetera. And so we ultimately decided it would be on this property in front. The reason being is that as you've read through the book, you know that there was quite a bit of torturing of potential witnesses for the trials that occurred after the subsequent to the actual killing and physical damage and physical harassment, etc., that occurred as part of the massacre. So this older Solomon, David Solomon, is sort of a patriarch, or was, for Eastern Arkansas. He died when he was 101, and he practiced law until the time he was 98, all of that kind of stuff. So anyway, the 2 Davids went to the county manager, county executive, told them they would like to do this. And by the way, I'm not telling you my role, but I was involved continuously. And county executive knew that the older Solomon was about ready to die. And because he had done so much for the county for so many years, the county itself felt that we should do this, we being the county, give him the ability to do this memorial. The Solomons paid for the memorial, but the county was really behind it as a testament, as a memorial really for what the older Solomon wanted to do with respect to this terrible event. So I'll probably answered the latter part, but we wove it into the first part. Is that helpful, or? I can't hear Ralph.
Sorry, I was muted. Yeah, it does seem. To what do you attribute the rest of the book would suggest that there might have been a strong resistance to it, but you're saying there wasn't much resistance. Now, this was a tribute to the status of the elder David Solomon.
In large measure, it was, and so the county executive, as well as major county officials, facilitated the development. We did everything. I was a co-chair of the committee, along with a federal judge who had lost 4 members of his family in the massacre. But it was the straw that stirred the drink was the Solomon family, and there was no one in the county really that felt the the need, nor did not want to incur the wrath of the rest of the county by standing in the way of David Solomon Sr., who wanted this to be done. Now, I will say that there were people both in Little Rock and in Elaine who opposed it being located in Helena. Just as I didn't go into this in a lot of detail in the book, but the massacre occurred throughout Phillips County. Only one person was actually killed in Elaine. Most of the killing fields were north of Elaine, several miles north of Elaine, but just as an easy handle to put on this event, it became the Elaine Race Massacre. But the people in Elaine wanted this memorial to occur in Elaine. Elaine virtually doesn't exist today. There are only 468 people, I think, who now live in Elaine. And they thought this would be an economic development tool. However, there would be no traffic in Elaine. Elaine is like 35 miles from where the memorial is located in Helena, which is the county seat. But we wanted it in where it was for two primary reasons. One is to indicate that this was a county-wide massacre. And number two, for all of the litigation and torturing that occurred subsequent to the killing of individuals in the massacre, for the court system really turned against the sharecroppers, the black sharecroppers. But it actually, as it turned out, if remembering the book and part about Moore versus Dempsey, the fact that there was so much torturing that went on, the U.S. Supreme Court nullified those convictions effectively, and therefore led to the freedom, and that decision of Moore versus Dempsey led to the freedom of the sharecroppers who had been unfairly and rapidly convicted of first and second degree murder immediately after the massacre. I could spend all day on this. I mean, it's just it's an incredible story, and I lived, step by step of it, and including after I had what had happened is how did you find out about it, Chester? Well, I had written the apology for the Episcopal Church when it formally apologized for its role in transatlantic slavery and related evils. And as I was doing my research to write the litany that was included in this national service, I came across a document called the Elaine Race Massacre, the Arkansas Race Riot by Ida B. Wells, who, the black iconic figure. And so I got very much interested in it. And as a result of that, this message got through to these various people that I told you about, and that precipitated our movement toward the creation of the memorial.
Okay, so I see, thank you for that. That's a very good, it encompassed the answer to a lot of questions that people had last week. I see that Donald, your hand is raised.
Thank you, Julia. I'm going to segue. By the way, Ralph, thanks for that question. That was really good. It was of particular interest to me. I want to segue onto that. I'd like to ask you bluntly and straight on, were there privately white people in Arkansas who threatened you because of the memorial being created in the first place? And second question is, were you ever really honestly threatened for writing the book? I mean, like people wanting to have you murdered?
There's the straight response is no. I was never threatened for my life. I will say that there were various ways that people responded to it in a very negative way that illustrates their desire for this book not to be given any attention. Now, the two statewide news outlets were very supportive of this book. The largest with distribution throughout the state is Democrat Gazette, and it wrote two very positive. There was one that was a review, and the other one was an overview of what I represented, and both of them were very positive. Then the Arkansas Times wrote another one. I did not expect that my hometown newspaper would be interested. I had a fan, I'm getting to your point, I had a fan in Virginia who prevailed upon the local newspaper to interview me and have an article published about the book and about me. And apparently what happened is that the local police came to the newspaper and asked them not to publish this because they were frightened by the nature of the book and by the people who still, especially in the Black community, that knew me, former students and that sort of thing, where I taught at Drew School. They were frightened of what they said, racial disturbances. Well, it really upset me. Not because they didn't do it, it was the way in which they snuffed the article out. So I had actually had the Arkansas Times follow this. And when the Times would inquire to the local newspaper, when are you going to publish this article? They'd say, well, we're still polishing it. We're still polishing it. So that was one side of it, and they never published it. Most of the resistance I had to the book and to this whole disclosure came from family members. I have a lot of relatives in Arkansas, and especially those with the last name Birch, the surname Birch, who have, they have the same name that my maternal grandfather surname. And so they really were offended that, and I really had nothing to do with. The Associated Press decided to write an article, and the Associated Press is picked up by locals and by local outlets, not just in Arkansas, but all over the world. And so there was an article written about me and also in conjunction with the centennial. And it was published throughout the state and with a lot of local units. And there were members of the family were very offended that I had talked about my maternal grandfather and had revealed that he participated in the massacre. But I will say this, that my wife and I have decided, for a variety of reasons, the way in which my name has been circulated in Monticello, that we will not go back, because as described in the book, I was attacked unsuccessfully, thank God, but I was attacked when I was teaching in the Black school in Monticello. And there have people have said things to me about my views, and therefore we really don't feel welcomed in my hometown. So,
and Chester,
that's long-winded. Oh, sorry, free to go ahead.
I was just going to add, and also we've learned that there's a very active Klan branch in the Monticello area.
Yeah. Let's become more aggressive in the last 10 to 15 years, and they have demonstrations and this, and so we've just decided, and we haven't been invited to come either, but I'm just saying we've decided we're not going to go down there.
Thank you for that, Chester. Richard, you
Thank
are next,
So,
and then Laura.
I have two unrelated questions. So one of them you already started to answer, and it has to do with the media coverage. You spoke about media coverage of your book and reviews of your book. But I'm curious to know what sort of media coverage there was to the actual memorial itself, and was there any effort by either of the local newspapers or, as you mentioned, the Associated Press, to educate their readers about what actually happened during the that massacre, so that people will know the actual reason for the memorial? So that's my first question. The second one has to do with you as a teacher and your students. You were with those students probably something like 40, 50 years ago. Is that correct?
Right.
So I'm just wondering whether you have maintained any contact with any of them, obviously not in person, but maybe, by other means during that time. So those are my two questions.
Okay. With respect to your first question, we could not have wished for coverage, any more coverage than we received nationally and internationally on the memorial and the massacre. It's hard for you to name any. I mean, the Journal did a big piece on it. New York Times did a big piece on it. The New York Times picked up the Associated Press piece. The Guardian newspaper picked up on it. It's just been, and I'm just leaving out, it was all over the country. We had no PR people working on this. It was just a matter of people's interest because of the history of it, with Ida B. Wells' role in it, and the story of Sheila and I coming together, and so this incredible experience that both of us had in terms of the mutual reconciliation and all of that. So it was given a lot of coverage, and there were local folks writing about it, primarily after the book was published. That's when the statewide newspapers picked up on it. Now, in response to the second question, the whole Elaine massacre experience actually created the opportunity. Well, first of all, you should understand that most of my students, I taught the 6th through the 12th grades in the all African American school for the year in advance of the integration of the local school system. But virtually without exception, I've written about this to some extent, that my Black students had their own diaspora, and they they just spread. By the way, as the damaged heritage references, the surprising thing I had as a teacher were so many of my students had come from either Chicago, St. Louis, California. I mean, their parents had sent them back to the South rather than because of all kinds of things, but the urban problems that Blacks were experiencing in ghettos, et cetera, et cetera. But so many of my students left. But Sheila and I spoke, I'll just quickly run it. We were asked to speak by the Delta Cultural Center in Phillips County on reconciliation, reflections and reconciliation, which we did, and I won't go through all of that. But as part of it, a clergyman from Phillips County came up to me one day the afternoon after we spoke, and said, "Did you ever teach in Black school in Monticello?" Which Monticello is about 60 miles away. And I said, "Yes, but how in the world did you hear about this?" And he said, "I have a clergyman who's a very close friend. He lives up in Jonesboro, which Jonesboro is about 100 miles north of Phillips County. And I was telling him about this event where you and Sheila were speaking. And he said, I know Chester Johnson." The clergyman said, "You couldn't know him. He's from New York. He lives in." I know that's Chester Johnson. And so I reached out to him. The unfortunate thing is that soon after I reached out to him, he became deathly ill, and we talked 3 times, and then he passed away. But I was fixated on that for a long time, for several months, because here was someone that remembered it and remembered our experiences the way that I remember. I mean, there was a bond there that was never going to be breached, and it was a wonderful. The fact he remembered meant so much to me.
Thank you.
Thank you. Tori.
Hi, thank you for being with us. I'm sorry I was late. I was having internet trouble. I have 2 questions, and they're kind of at opposite ends of the book in a way. The first was, I thought it was fascinating when you wrote about being young and your interactions with the African-American kids who were, the 2 streets backed up. And I had the sense reading it, and I wondered if I was right, that on both sides, you were all kind of you knew the rules, that you could be friends in your backyards, but then when you left that space and went out into the town writ large, you couldn't be. And was that something you all just kind of, A, is that true? And B, how did you all know that? Was it just by breathing the air?
Yeah, I mean, it was breathing the air and understanding in all kinds of overt and subtle ways. I mean, as I wrote about it in the book, we felt we owned that field behind
Right.
our houses, our respective houses, and that we were free to have friendship relationships. I mean, we were very young at the
Right.
time, but we felt that. But each of us knew that we couldn't cross the boundaries. As soon as one of us crossed the boundary on it would no longer work. So if I had to go to the bathroom, I'd go home. There, the East Shelton, 308 East Shelton. If either any of those of the Black children had to, they went home. we never had meals together, but it was, and I was just looking at it retrospectively, I was astounded. We were 5 years old, and
That's
yet
right.
we understood that there were certain things you could not do, and that we could not break certain codes. On the other hand, which was you didn't ask this question, but I'll just feed
Yeah,
in.
no, please do.
It's what was fascinating later on, looking back, is that all the adults, their parents, my friends' parents, my mother, had no problems about our being friends. And why? I mean, these were, their parents, my mother, they were part of this large cabal. And they knew that institutionally, over time, we would be prohibited from continuing these relationships.
Right.
They said, all right, let them play, let them, spend time together, let them be friends now. But, the great alligator is going to get them someday. And that's what happened.
Right.
As soon as schools, and we went to segregated schools, it only took a few years for those friendships to break
Right.
down. And what was also fascinating, and I made this point, is I really forgot what they looked like.
Huh.
I mean, over time, it was just, except for one occasion, and that was that there was a black Boy Scout, white Boy Scout, and there was a decision that there, at some level, that they would put the two together for one afternoon, and we would deliver circulars throughout where we live. And so some of my friends from that, when I was much younger, black friends, we were able to be together to distribute
Again.
circulars. So,
But
that
that
was
was
the
really
only
it.
time. That was it.
Wow. Wow. Thank you. And then my other question, which is a very different question, is you write so elegantly and thoughtfully about filial pietism, and you write about, and I, in reading it, as we got towards the end of the book, I found myself wondering whether you think that will ever go away, because it seems to me as long as that exists, we don't finally move forward, right? Because if there are always, so is there a place where do you imagine that there's a place or a moment or a time where that chain could actually be broken and people's desire to move forward would be stronger than what's bred into them as a kind of urge to revere the past? Is there a way to break that chain, and do you see it breaking?
I don't see it actually breaking. What I do see is hopefully over time, people will acknowledge the damaging effect that filial pietism can have on our own freedom, white and black, and that for good reasons there should be skepticism with respect to our own, because society is built in this mechanism where it is seen that filial pietism, or what may say, well, up to filial pietism, is a positive thing. Honor your father and mother, which implicitly honor your grandmother, your grandfather, etc. And over time, as we know through racism and white supremacy and all of that, that there are some very negative aspects of what is seen as positive attributes, that is, having value, watching over your elders, etc., etc. But there are trends that are happening now that do reduce the impact of it. Because when we lived in a really more of an agrarian society, you know, families were both economic engines as well as whatever.
Right.
And we can just identify all kinds. But it was so close knit that family mythologies, this excessive veneration was easy to happen. But for example, in 1900, 40% of the people lived in urban areas in the United States. Now, over 83% of the country lives now it depends on definitions of what's urban or whatever, but we've gotten to a point where, there's even there's an anti-filiopietism term, a family of choice.
Right.
And
well, that's interesting. Yeah.
And we are gradually moving where in a direction that would be counter to the filiopietism. And that is very, very helpful. And we are moving toward, and I'm just not talking with respect to the United States. We have, as a world at large, we are moving more toward individualism. There's a book, I would just, if this is something that people are really interested in following, is there's a Oxford scholar, his name is Larry Seidentop, sorry, Seidentop. And he's written a book called, and it's only 2 books that he's written. He's actually from Chicago, but he has spent his entire academic career at Oxford, and it's called Inventing the Individual. And he traces the idea of he doesn't call it, I came up with filiopietism, but he traces the idea all the way back from what was going on. The Greeks and the Romans actually worshipped their their family members as gods, and and we have gradually, and it's been very slow march, but we have been marching toward individualism, and so I see that happening, but very slowly. But that as we move toward individualism, the role of filiopietism plays less of a role. I mean, when I was writing this book, I went back to Helena Phillipson and interviewed a whole bunch of people. And I interviewed a woman who was one of the descendants of the white planters who participated in this massacre. And she had a son who was then living in Nashville. And so I had a long conversation with this woman who was the descendant of a white planter. She went into all the reasons why this memorial was a bad idea, and it was going to increase divisions within the county, and that there was going to be resistance and revenge by blacks and blah, 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 blah. So I get a note from her son who hears about this and said, don't believe her. No, I have an entirely different view on this. We need more disclosure. We need blah, blah. So even in that environment, you can tell that there's division of over time, opinions can change, perspectives can change. Even mine, I mean, my perspective on this world at large with race bears no resemblance whatsoever to my mother, and certainly not to my grandparents. So
it's interesting. It may be why some people are so vehemently opposed to the ideas of families of choice, because they understand that if you adopt that, you're undercutting something else.
Right. Yeah. Especially if you're tied to filiopietism in any way.
Thank you.
So I'm going to ask a question here. This question came from John, who's my co-facilitator, and couldn't be here because he's flying to Liberia as we speak, if the plane left on time. He said that for him, the beauty and the power of the book lies in confronting and reconciling a situation in your own family and background. For those of us who don't have or don't know about ancestors that took part in such events, what do you suggest we should be doing to help overcome the ugly racism that's still so prevalent in our society?
Well, it's a very good question. And I do have an answer for it. Because my own view is that we've done much less in terms of individual integration, establishment of close relationships, personal relationships with persons of color, and that there is a deep-rooted need for us to stop relying on big organizations to solve this problem of race, and it be done on an individual basis as much as possible. And I see this as a three-pronged problem. One is, I think that there's a need at some point, even though you don't, most of us white folks don't realize that a lot of our, I mean, this whole privilege issue, this whole way of dealing with especially Black folks is so overwhelming, and it so permeates our lives in such a way we don't even realize in any major degree. And I think that we need to, at least the gesture be forgiven at some point. And so you say, well, what do I need to be forgiven for? Well, it goes back to white privilege, all the rest of the stuff. But I don't think a Black person should forgive me for being white unless I've done two things. And one is, all right, let's say that I never came across Elaine Race Massacre, and that how do I adjust? How do I show that I'm attempting to become part of the solution and not just continuing to add to future problems, foisting the problem forward. For one, I think that individuals should not try to figure out a way of excusing themselves. We all know that over the 400 years of Black subjugation, what has happened, and that there's a reason for us to personally acknowledge the truth of what happened, what has happened over that time or period, and not to take refuge in filial pietism and saying, oh, well, my parents and my grandparents did this, they didn't know any better. We have to admit what has happened, even though there may not be an Elaine in someone's background, there or any other, whatever. There have been so many massacres and excuse me, sort of ghetto killings and all massive killings and all that kind of stuff. I don't, but we know what happened. And there's a need to ask for forgiveness for that on a larger basis. And then the second thing is, I spent a lot of time in the book talking about the genuinely human. And some people call it, excuse me, authentic passion. Yeah, they're both the same, and that is that there's something that's deeper and more valuable than the history, the customs, the language, the accents that separate us. There's something more fundamental than that. And you want to put a name on it, a genuinely human, authentic passion, whatever. But we can use that for purposes of having personal relationships with Black folks. And that's what Sheila and I tried, and I think successfully did, in developing this incredibly close relationship with each other and with our families. So that's what I'm in capturing those two things. I think a white person is in a position to ask for forgiveness. And I think we need forgiveness. But I don't think, my own view is all of this it's important to be done on an individual, personal basis, in friendship, love, and not institutionally dependent to solve these racial problems. Don't want to sound like a preacher, but anyway, that's my view.
Thank you for that. I appreciate that very much. Dorothy, your hand is raised.
Yeah, Chester, when I read about how a supposed family friend took you into a very dangerous situation with the Peckerwoods, and that was terrifying. But did you ever feel overwhelming loneliness? I mean, I understand your mother not being around that summer. I get that, she had to live there and you didn't.
It was a full year. It wasn't just the summer. It was the entire year.
Oh dear. But I do still understand it. And I got the impression you did too.
Right.
But what about loneliness? Relatives are against you. These people that maybe you knew your whole life, the Peckerwoods, I don't know. Did you know some of them? I mean, you did know the supposed family friend. Did you know some of those ruffians?
I knew who they were, and the head person, the lead Peckerwood, was known to be sort of the chief of the Peckerwoods of Monticello. So I knew about them, and I had, but I didn't have relationships. But I would have to say that what happened to me that year, it wasn't necessarily feeling lonely, which I actually didn't. But I was so busy with the Black community, and they were so engaged with me that I never thought about being solitary. And that all of this was, and yet there were people who felt inclined to tell me that they knew that I was doing what I was doing was right, and that they wouldn't admit it publicly. I'm talking about white folks. And but no, I never felt loneliness. I really loved teaching that year and spending all that time, not just with my students, but my students allowed me, and actually running for mayor did too, allowed me to get into homes and get into discussions that supplemented the life I was leading as a teacher. So I know you would think that I felt isolated and alone and all of that, but I never felt that. It was a joyful, it was actually a joyful year for me.
I'm glad. The other thing is you mentioned in the same chapter that you felt we were in a second civil war. And I sometimes think the first civil war never really ended because you're talking about people's hearts and guts and minds. I don't know if you agree with that, and now I feel like maybe we are in the second civil war right now, today, and it's terrifying. I mean, we just never seem to really solve this.
Now, when I referred to the Second Civil War in that instance, I was really referring to I was looking at what happened in the mid-60s to the South through Freedom Summer and but there was an invasion. It wasn't Sherman's invasion, but when the three young civil rights workers were killed in Philadelphia, Mississippi, Cheney, Goodman, and Schwerner. The federal government came down with over 200 investigators into Neshoba County to investigate. Now, and the local folks in Philadelphia, in Neshoba County, felt their idea was, listen, those kids came down here, they knew there was danger. And so they found it. And I'm just telling you, that's the way white folks viewed this. So why in the world should the federal government send 200 investigators to Neshoba County to investigate these three killings? They asked for it. And so, and there were so many other examples of the aggressiveness that it was seen as a second invasion, if you will. Not unlike, yes, it was different from Sherman's invasion in March through Georgia and all that stuff, but it was seen that way, and that's what I was trying to communicate. And that in some ways, a lot of the attitudes hadn't changed. To say those three guys deserve to be killed is an outrageous viewpoint. But if you look at it from their point of view of saying, this is our life. We've arranged it this way. We've got segregated cultures here, and whites live this way, blacks live that way, and we're keeping it this way. We have the right to make that decision, and you're coming down here to try to change us. That's a second, from their point of view, they were seeing a second civil war.
I understand. Thank you. That's good. Yeah.
I would like to ask if any of the people who haven't spoken have questions. Michael, Liz, Amanda, Naveen, and Fred. Do any of you have questions?
Hi, this is Fred. I do have a question. I joined the group rather late, and unfortunately I wasn't able to read your book, but it sounds fascinating. In terms of the Elaine Massacre, just wondering, based on your knowledge of other similar incidents, are these things kind of preceded by sort of an inchoate rage, or is there sort of common, what's the word, pre-indicators that something like this is about to happen? I'm just asking the question in case there's some way that we can anticipate and maybe forestall these kind of things from happening.
Well, I'm glad you asked the question. In this instance, it was in some ways a national policy. It sounds strange, but you just put yourself in the circumstances of the time. World War I was just ending, and a large number of blacks served in World War I, and a number of them were honored in various ways in the European theater. And when they came back, they expected to be treated with more equity and respect than when they had left the shores of the United States. And as this created concern throughout the country, this attitude and there were these types of physical battlements that occurred in especially the summer and fall of 1919. The black poet James Weldon Johnson put a term, the red summer of 1919, and there were I wouldn't call them massacres, but there was violence in black versus white attacks in conflicts running from Arizona up to the Northeast and all these places in between, Nebraska, South Carolina, Washington, D.C., Chicago. And the Wilson administration had actually, because of the concern of these types of conflicts where blacks were not being passive, they were being responsive to, in many ways, they sent out people from the Justice Department to sort of, investigate where these things were happening. Well, in Elaine, it had all started because of the economics. That is, sharecroppers, many of the black sharecroppers had been veterans, and they were being treated unfairly. In fact, they had hired a white attorney out of Little Rock to represent their complaints. And a union was set up in Winchester, Arkansas, for the entire section, Southeast Arkansas. And there was a lodge being created in Elaine for being part of this union. And that was the precipitating factor. The September 30th, Tuesday night, 11 o'clock, whites descend, start shooting into this church where they're meeting. And they really didn't realize that there were these guards. And in turn, the guards killed one of them who worked for the same company that my maternal grandfather did. He was killed. Deputy sheriff was shot in the leg, and this was seen as a black insurrection. Then the next day, that's when all hell broke loose, and lots of blacks were killed. And then white officials reached out to Washington, D.C. and to the state and said, we're being overwhelmed by this black insurrection, and you've got to send troops in. And they did, and troops with machine guns, and we don't know how much damage they did. We do know, we have the numbers to show that it was more than 100, but it could have been hundreds. Who knows? That may have been an indirect way of answering your question, but I can tell you the signs were there from the very end of World War I. And whites, for example, in that part of the country, made the decision, we're not changing. It may even get worse. And there had been burnings of blacks alive, lynchings, and all of that stuff throughout Southeast Arkansas prior to the Elaine Massacre, one of which had happened. One of those lynchings occurred in my hometown. So I don't know. I'm just giving you, reciting history for you as opposed to giving guidance on that matter.
Okay, we are a little over the hour, and I want to be respectful of everybody's time, but I also want to let everybody have a chance to ask their questions. So last call for questions. Raise your Zoom hand if you have one. Ralph. Ralph, unmute.
Thanks. Yeah, I don't know how well you can answer that. I'm particularly interested in the process of school integration, and I have a couple of relatives who were involved in the school integration in Boston, South Boston, if you know the story of there, where there was a black school and a white school, and they were sort of cross integrated. And it seems to me the processes were somewhat different, but there are certain parallels in both cases. Ultimately, immediately or ultimately, the black school shut down. Black kids went to the white school. I think, as you say, the black kids were generally sort of thought that integrating the white school was a good idea, even though it was difficult at the time. A lot of the white kids, I guess, left the white school when the black kids came in. I wondered if you knew anything about what the process was in the school in the few years after integration. Did it settle down fairly quickly, or was it pretty disruptive? Was the white school ever closed? Do you know what happened there?
Well, Monticello was a little bit different, and they congratulated themselves over some time. And I have a little bit of a problem with this idea of integration. It was really an absorption. It was the black children, at least in Monticello, were absorbed into high school, into the school system, and then the black schools were closed down, or they were modified in some way to provide some other related services, offices, and that sort of thing. But generally speaking, what happened in Southeast Arkansas is that these Christian academies were established. Sort of strange use of terms, but they were created to circumvent the fact that there were powers that could be applied in a public environment that wouldn't be applied to private schools. So a very large number of the localities in Southeast Arkansas had created these white Christian academies where the white students went there and the public schools were left be not 100%, close to 100% black. And it went through certain iterations where it would take time to make that transition. But the ultimate goal was to have this white experience for the white students, as opposed to the integration of the school. And that did not happen in my hometown, and they really congratulated themselves about it. And I think, that to that extent, they deserve it, because they stood in juxtaposition so many schools within that area of the state. But that was sort of the process, and many of those academies still exist. It just has become part of life in that part of the world. And it wasn't just Arkansas, you know, that happened in Mississippi and Alabama. And this was a way that the South combated related to this process. But before getting out too much out of that, I just wanted to make one point about going back for a moment to Neshoba County and how much the issue that we're talking about, the black-white process and conflicts, and the racism and all the rest, has been fundamental to the country as a whole. A lot of people don't realize that the very first campaign stop that Ronald Reagan took when he was seeing nodding, he took after being nominated in, I think it was 1980, right?
1980.
Yeah. And was, after he left the convention, first campaign stop was in Neshoba County, Mississippi. Neshoba County was like, you know, the 23rd largest county in Mississippi. Why in the world would Ronald Reagan in 1960 go to Neshoba County? Because that's where 3 civil rights activists were murdered. And he was giving a blessing to that county and what had happened in that county. I mean, it's phenomenal. And I mean, obviously a lot of political types don't want that information to be well developed, but the reason I'm saying it is it's so integral. I may be overreacting because I live this stuff so much, but it's it just seems to me that there's very few pieces of policy, American policy, or that doesn't have fingerprints of racism all over it. And there's also, I'm sorry to say it, but I will say it. And I don't want to offend anybody, but I really, you know, the Republican Party, the mouse has eaten the elephant. The giant, you know, the South actually has controlled. If you look over history, Southern viewpoint on race and other significant policy issues have been adopted by the Republican Party, and it's I you know, I don't want to get political. I'm just telling you that it's phenomenal to me how much the Southern policies, particularly on race, have become nationalized over time, and it's very disturbing for me. I'm sure you're going to cut me off at that, and I apologize.
Oh, no, don't look to me to cut you off on that. Some of the people here know my leanings all too well. I just want to say, yeah, you know,
Yeah.
Project 2025 is a scary document. But help me thank Chester and Frida for being with us.
Thank you
And,
so much.
Thank you for inviting me.
And for your book.
yes, thank you for writing the book, most of all.
On its way, by the way. It's not exactly this, but it's the topic is it's the same. So like not Elaine, but the issue of racial reconciliation and racial healing. A few thoughts that you've already heard me espouse today, so which will be appearing in a separate. I'm at a deadline. I've got to get it to my agent the end of the month, and then we'll see what happens. But I've been working tenaciously on finishing it up. I did have a manuscript that went in several months ago, and my publisher said, too much history, too little Chester.
Oh,
Oh,
They wanted more of my views. Anyway, sorry. Doing advanced marketing.
yes, we look forward to it. And I had told people it was off limits to ask about the next book, but we do look forward to it, and maybe we'll have you back after it's come out and we've read it.
Thank you.
So
Well,
thanks.
it's a long time it's a long distance from the lip to the cup. It'll be, it takes a while to turn all these things around. But thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it. And I hope I
Thank
didn't
you.
proselytize too much, but
Mhm.
I
No.
live with these things, living with it so much that it's hard not to come out in these sessions.
Great.
Thank you again.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Be
And
well
thank
all.
Thank you very much.
Just a reminder to the group, we are now on hiatus till after Labor Day. John and I will be in communication with you before September about how far to read in our next book.
So the
that's
Monday after Labor Day.
Monday after Labor Day.
Okay.
Okay,
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
bye-bye all.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye then.